Chapters 27 and 28 of The Way of All Flesh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. The Way of All Flesh by Samuel Butler. Chapter 27. I will give no more of the details of my hero's earlier years. Enough that he struggled through them, and at 12 years old knew every page of his Latin and Greek grammars by heart. He had read the greater part of Virgil, Horace, and Livy, and I do not know how many Greek plays. He was proficient in arithmetic, knew the first 4 books of Euclid thoroughly, and had a fair knowledge of French. It was now time he went to school, and to school he was accordingly to go, under the famous Dr. Skinner of Roughborough. Theobald had known Dr. Skinner slightly at Cambridge. He had been a burning and a shining light in every position he had filled, from his boyhood upwards. He was a very great genius. Everyone knew this. They said indeed that he was one of the few people to whom the word genius could be applied without exaggeration. Had he not taken I don't know how many university scholarships in his freshman year? Had he not been afterwards senior wrangler, first chancellor's medalist, and I do not know how many more things besides? And then he was such a wonderful speaker. At the Union Debating Club he had been without a rival, and had of course been president. His moral character, a point on which so many geniuses were weak, was absolutely irreproachable. Foremost of all, however, among his many great qualities, and perhaps more remarkable even than his genius, was what biographers have called the simple-minded and childlike earnestness of his character, an earnestness which might be perceived by the solemnity with which he spoke even about trifles. It is hardly necessary to say he was on the liberal side in politics. His personal appearance was not particularly prepossessing. He was about middle height, portly, and had a couple of fierce grey eyes that flashed fire from beneath a pair of great bushy beetling eyebrows, and overawed all who came near him. It was in respect of his personal appearance, however, that if he was vulnerable at all, his weak place was to be found. His hair when he was a young man was red, but after he had taken his degree he had a brain fever which caused him to have his head shaved. When he reappeared he did so wearing a wig, and one which was a good deal further off red than his own hair had been. He not only had never discarded the wig, but year after year it had edged itself a little more and a little more off red, till by the time he was 40 there was not a trace of red remaining, and his wig was brown. When Dr. Skinner was a very young man, hardly more than 25, the headmastership of Roughborough Grammar School had fallen vacant, and he had been unhesitatingly appointed. The result justified the selection. Dr. Skinner's pupils distinguished themselves at whichever university they went to. He moulded their minds after the model of his own, and stamped an impression upon them which was indelible in after life. Whatever else a Roughborough man might be, he was sure to make everyone feel that he was a God-fearing earnest Christian and a liberal, if not a radical, in politics. Some boys, of course, were incapable of appreciating the beauty and loftiness of Dr. Skinner's nature. Some such boys, alas, there will be in every school. Upon them Dr. Skinner's hand was very properly a heavy one. His hand was against them and theirs against him during the whole time of the connection between them. They not only disliked him, but they hated all that he more especially embodied, and throughout their lives disliked all that reminded them of him. Such boys, however, were in a minority, the spirit of the place being decidedly Skinnerian. I once had the honor of playing a game of chess with this great man. It was during the Christmas holidays, and I had come down to Roughborough for a few days to see Alethea Pontifex, who was then living there, on business. It was very gracious of him to take notice of me. for if I was a light of literature at all, it was of the very lightest kind. It is true that in the intervals of business I had written a good deal, but my works had been almost exclusively for the stage, and for those theatres that devoted themselves to extravaganza and burlesque. I had written many pieces of this description, full of puns and comic songs, and they had had a fair success, but my best piece had been a treatment of English history during the Reformation period, in the course of which I had introduced Cranmer, Sir Thomas More, Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon, and Thomas Cromwell, in his youth better known as the Malleus Monachorum, and had made them dance a breakdown. I had also dramatized The Pilgrim's Progress for a Christmas pantomime, and made an important scene of Vanity Fair, with Mr. Greatheart, Apollyon, Christiana, Mercy, and Hopeful as the principal characters. The orchestra played music taken from Handel's best-known works, but the time was a good deal altered, and altogether the tunes were not exactly as Handel left them. Mr. Greatheart was very stout, and he had a red nose. He wore a capacious waistcoat and a shirt with a huge frill down the middle of the front. Hopeful was up to as much mischief as I could give him. He wore the costume of a young swell of the period, and had a cigar in his mouth which was continually going out. Christiana did not wear much of anything. Indeed, it was said that the dress which the stage manager had originally proposed for her had been considered inadequate even by the Lord Chamberlain. But this is not the case. With all these delinquencies upon my mind, it was natural that I should feel convinced of sin while playing chess, which I hate, with the great Dr. Skinner of Roughborough, the historian of Athens and editor of Demosthenes. Dr. Skinner, moreover, was one of those people who pride themselves on being able to set people at their ease at once, and I had been sitting on the edge of my chair all the evening, but I have always been very easily overawed by a schoolmaster. The game had been a long one, and at 9:30, when supper came in, we had each of us a few pieces remaining. "What will you take for supper, Dr. Skinner?" said Mrs. Skinner in a silvery voice. He made no answer for some time, but at last in a tone of almost superhuman solemnity he said, first, "Nothing," and then, "Nothing whatever." By and by, however, I had a sense come over me as though I were nearer the consummation of all things than I had ever yet been. The room seemed to grow dark as an expression came over Dr. Skinner's face which showed that he was about to speak. The expression gathered force, the room grew darker and darker. "Stay," he at length added, and I felt that here at any rate was an end to a suspense which was rapidly becoming unbearable. "Stay, I may presently take a glass of cold water, and a small piece of bread and butter." As he said the word butter, his voice sank to a hardly audible whisper. Then there was a sigh as though of relief when the sentence was concluded, as the universe this time was safe. Another 10 minutes of solemn silence finished the game. The doctor rose briskly from his seat and placed himself at the supper table. "Mrs. Skinner," he exclaimed jauntily, "what are those mysterious-looking objects surrounded by potatoes?" "Those are oysters, Dr. Skinner." "Give me some, and give Overton some." And so on till he had eaten a good plate of oysters, a scallop shell of minced veal nicely browned, some apple tart, and a hunk of bread and cheese. This was the small piece of bread and butter. The cloth was now removed, and tumblers with teaspoons in them, a lemon or two, and a jug of boiling water were placed upon the table. Then the great man unbent. His face beamed. "And what shall it be to drink?" he exclaimed persuasively. "Shall it be brandy and water? No, it shall be gin and water. Gin is the more wholesome liquor." So gin it was, hot and stiff too. Who can wonder at him or do anything but pity him? Was he not headmaster of Roughborough School? To whom had he owed money at any time? Whose ox had he taken? Whose ass had he taken, or whom had he defrauded? What whisper